Welcome to Discerning Faith Podcast. I am Daryl.
Hi, I'm Nathan.
In last episode, we started our mad dash through European political and spiritual history. Today, we're going to cover the Chivalric Code and the Crusades. This continues our series on Christianity and government. Thanks so much for joining us.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chivalric Code.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah, I like it pretty well.
Okay.
So we talked about last time, like kind of the big picture for Europe, some of the commonalities you can see between some of the different regions in Europe. And one of the other commonalities it had was the Chivalric Code and reasons why the Chivalric Code was needed.
Mm-hmm.
If you couldn't figure it out now, medieval Europe, there were quite a few warrior-like societies and bosses running about. Lots of petty warlords who thought, you know, I deserve that guy's stuff over there. I'm going to take it now. I want his territory. It's mine now.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led to a lot of, violence overall, but also a lot of warriors, and eventually it would be known as knights about. And the idea of what a knight was early on is a lot different from what it was later on, and kind of how we picture it these days as well. It changed in its usage over time.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of early on, a knight was just a dude who could have a horse, a dude who had the right gear, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have to have a lot of other fancy requirements with it.
And maybe a little bit of martial training.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good warrior, often a blue-collar type warrior, not necessarily highfalutin like we might think of it, but afford the horse, afford the gear, and yep, if you're good enough, you even get lands for doing it well enough. So that's those very low entry requirements to get.
Relatively low. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not like you could just go out and buy a horse. Anybody could. But yeah.
But not quite as a high bar as we think of it these days.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, though, that would change over.
Right. So later on, you know, with the knights, there becomes the whole bloodline and you know, you have to have your heraldry correct,
Mm-hmm.
your coat of arms, which is a familial thing. And so it becomes almost a hereditary title.
Because these guys got this land and they don't want to give it up to just anybody now. So we're keeping it in the family.
Absolutely. And so it comes with, you know, you go from almost, you know, just anybody who can buy a horse and get some martial training to this is a bequeathed title, something that's passed from generation to generation. And, you know, anybody who has that is kind of a lord almost at that point. And, you know, they kind of look down on average people and not anybody could just, you'd have to literally produce your family line and prove that you were, you know, of someone of note.
It was very regulated.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very regulated. I think even to the point that like the way your heraldry was made and your coat of arms was made was somewhat, depending on the region.
You could just have your child's drawing that you put up on your fridge be a doodle for your heraldry and just produce that for the family.
I don't know. My kid's Godzilla was pretty nice. That'd have been cool on a shield. But anyway, so, you know, we just kind of mentioned you had to buy a horse, right? So horse is kind of like a car nowadays, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's maintenance. You have to buy the horse, which was expensive to begin with. Then you have to buy horseshoes, feed, or land with grass. You know, then you have all of your accoutrements that you have. It's a good word. I don't know where that came from. That was nice. Anyway, you have to have all the things that make you a knight, right? So you got to have a shield. You got to have armor of some sort. Now,
you got to have people to help take care of this all for you because this is a little time consuming and you ain't got that time.
So you got a squire. You've got, yeah, absolutely. You have to at least have a close enough blacksmith that you have to spend money on for horseshoes and all this. And something that's also interesting that we didn't highlight from early versus later, just because I love knights. The whole idea of knights is just kind of a cool thing to me. I've always been drawn to that. But
me too. I like sleep.
Yeah, that too. But these are the K-Knights. And so it's interesting because we think of them in full plate armor, really big, bulky armor, you know, big old shield and all that. And that is the case later on. But early on, it's probably more what's quick to put on and off, what's somewhat protective
and somewhat comfortable. You got to move around in this for a long time on march, man. This is really killing me.
Right. But a little aside, plate mail was actually pretty movable, malleable, and everything. It actually wasn't, we think of it as, oh, they're just these big tanks that are all stuck, and you guys can see how I'm moving my body right now. But
Stiff and rigid.
yeah, real stiff and rigid. But actually, they were pretty smart in the way they made it, and there were these joints that they can manipulate pretty well. So
Still heavy, but
yeah, in fact, you can even find people nowadays, and very similar to what was back then, doing like acrobatic things that you wouldn't think you could do. It's actually kind of interesting. That's an aside. But anyway, so there's high cost, violence upon violence, all that good stuff, or bad stuff.
if you need resources, keep paying up for this instead of, well, that guy has resources that don't keep paying up for this, so I'm going to take his stuff. That way I can continue to be in it.
That grass looks greener than this grass, right? Or he's got a lot of servants. Maybe they could help me out. And so there's this constant kind of fighting and land grabbing and all that. And so
Lots of violence.
the church gets involved.
With the violence?
No, actually to curb the violence. So
That seems good.
yeah. So, I think as Americans, we tend to kind of think government or some sort of entity getting involved. Sometimes we don't really want that because we're very individualistic, or we don't know that they have our best interest at heart, because we know what we want and what we need.
We're so great at that.
Yeah. Anyway. So the church steps in, wants to curb the violence. And so they come up with a kind of a program, or just a way of kind of trying to work through it. And they come up with the truce of God and the peace of God. So the truce of God, it says, okay, look, you're going to fight. We're not going to stop you from doing that. We can't stop you, but let's do it on the right times, at the right times. So don't fight on the Sabbath. So no Sunday fighting. Okay. No holy days.
Oh,
And don't do it during the winter.
but why?
Well, see, the winter, resources are scarce, right?
Yeah, that's why we just take it from the peasants.
But then they don't have them, and then it gets more scarce.
That seems like a damn problem.
So they say, not only that, but think about it this way. War creates dispossessed people. And so in the winter, that's even harsher, right? And so they're trying to curb some of this. The next thing is the peace of God. Don't kill peasants.
But why? They were in the way.
Exactly. So it's kind of to create. And so, when we think of chivalry now, we're starting to see some of those tenets coming in. Guess what? The church came up with that. Pretty good. So don't kill peasants. Don't kill non-combatants. Just don't be a jerk, maybe.
Don't kill people who aren't fighting back.
Yeah.
They're going to kill each other. Go do it over there.
Yeah. So, don't do that. In fact, to kind of push onto this chivalric code a little bit more, there is I can't pronounce it in French, and I don't want to have to say every time I say it. So we're just going to anglicize it and call him Christian of Troy. And he was a pastor / bishop / poet, something like that. Yeah. Are we going to start?
Yeah. They're doing the snaps.
No. Yeah. So he's a pastor, and he decides he's going to write just an ideal, I think. I think from what I understand, the intent was an ideal of how a knight should conduct himself, and kind of try to kind of persuade, which this actually becomes a little bit more persuasive than the whole "don't put rules on me, man." And so he writes about somebody you might know about.
No, I've heard of them.
I think so. Something about a square. No, that's not right. There's some sort of shape. No, round table. That's it. So the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur. He's the one that comes up with the legend of King Arthur. He's the one that kind of, comes up with the idea of the epic quest for good, right? And so the idea is that, there would be some nobility to these knights, not nobility as in titles, but as in conduct, right?
Still warriors.
Yeah.
Well, fierce in battle, but
use your prowess in a positive way.
in the service to others and for greater good.
Yep.
And you were talking about there was, it's a very different legend than a lot of modern media remakes of it have been, where particularly for Sir Lancelot, he has a thing for his master, his lord's wife, Guinevere, And modern remakes is like, well, whatever you want. That's just obviously what is right. There's nothing wrong with that. So go sleep with your master life. You know, no, that's totally legit. Not what the original version was at all. I know it really stood Daryl's.
Yeah, yeah. I remember. I'm going to call my parents a little bit. Hopefully, it's okay with this. At least my mom. I think there was a movie about King Arthur, and I believe, if I'm right, Sean Connery was Arthur, and I think it was Sean Connery, and Richard Gere was Lancelot. And this was when Richard Gere was really young and, you know, even more so attractive, apparently, to women, and whatever that means. And so, um, you know, the whole idea is that, well, he's fallen in love with her and maybe they should have never even gotten married. It's really his fault for marrying someone that wasn't in love. And like, we can get into a whole nother aside with what love is and all that, but I think we'll pass on that for now. But, you know, and it's, well, follow your heart. What does the Bible say about your heart?
It is deceitful above all else.
Yeah. So he kind of, the way it's written originally by a good old Christian, kind of interesting that's his name. But anyway, way Christian originally writes it is Lancelot sees his duty to the people, to his lord, and even to Guinevere, that he cannot act on these feelings. And he actually, the idea is that he suppresses that and goes about his business as if that's not a thing. You know, he still deals with it. Those passions are still there, but he denies those passions in service of really God and King, right? And to me, that's so much more noble than, well, I couldn't keep it in my pants. And not to be crass, but I mean, legitimately, that's what it is. So, yeah, I thought that was really cool. I've always liked the idea of the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur. And of course, you can't go without good Monty Python.
Yeah.
That's always fun. But, you know, I think it lost some of its luster as I grew, especially like those kind of movies and stuff where it's like, why? Honestly, that another aside, we're just going to go with it. Why not? We've got time to fill, right? You know, there's two of my favorite movies, and they kind of go along with this. So the first is Kingdom of Heaven. Are you familiar with that at all? Just curious.
I've only seen bits and pieces. I don't think I've ever seen the full thing through.
So it's about Orlando Bloom. I mean, literally him. He's
about Orlando Bloom.
Yeah. So he's a French. He's in France when the movie starts, and he's a blacksmith. And
What's with him being a blacksmith?
Yeah, well, you know, maybe that's his thing. I don't know. And so why am I blanking on his name? The actor so his dad, basically long lost father, comes and says, hey, I'm going on a crusade, come with me. He's like, no, I'm fine. But then he kills the local priest, and because he's like holding over hell for his wife, because his wife was a suicide. So he kills her, and he's like, well, I got to absolve my sins, I'm going to go, which this kind of leads into our next section. So this actually kind of works out well. And he goes to find not glory, but redemption, I guess is the right word, in the Holy Land in the Crusade. And I think it's supposed to be during the Third Crusade because he fights against Saladin. And so I love it because there's this duty that he takes. Now, it's a very modern telling of it, and we'll get into why there's some big problems with it. But he's this very honorable man until the Queen of Jerusalem finds him attractive, and then they commit adultery together. And it's like, so everything he just worked for to be this virtuous, chivalrous man, and you're just wasted, you know. And that's modern Hollywood. But Braveheart has something similar like that, where you're like, you know, you build up those William Wallace's, this, which granted, none of it's historical really, but there's the Battle of Sterling Bridge, and that's about all they get, right? That happened. But anyway, but, you know, and then he falls for the queen as well, and then commits adultery again. And it's like, come on. So
it's a modern warping of it is just, it's not as inspiring for the good as what it was originally done. It's like, let's just go back to that.
Right.
And it was, on the note, it was very inspiring for people at the time, because we talked about the true speeds of God. Those were pushed by the church, but they weren't quite as effective because they were done in Latin, which was the language of the church at the time. And it got some reach out there, but not everyone used Latin frequently or really, you know, even understood Latin. Christian of Troy and his works, King Arthur and others beside, were all done in the local languages. And so they were able to be spread much more quickly and inspire people to this noble code. And unfortunately, the earlier had more directly theological arguments from the church. So, so it's kind of an interesting way that a pastor was able to still reach out and change the culture around him, the culture of strong and fierce dudes out there for the better.
Well, I mean, I guess we're going on asides in this episode, so we're the hosts. You can deal with it. But it kind of makes you wonder, like, how do we engage culture? You know, we've seen the Christian movies. Some are good. Most of them are not, as in not necessarily bad content, but well done. And maybe aspiring to arts that inspire people is a good thing if you're pointing them to Christ through it, you know? And so there might be something to be said for that.
Yeah, the quest for the Holy Grail. It's literally the Eucharist. It is the communion cup. It's like the whole point of that was supposed to point to is seek answers, seek the meanings of life and the greater things in the church and in the rituals and in all of that as well. So
right. Well, and it's always that what I love about those stories most of the time is it's not about something for their gain, but for the greater good. And that's really what we're called to do, right? Is work for the greater good, not just our good. Yeah. So speaking of crusades and things, that's our
Volt.
What'd you say?
Deus Volt. That rules it.
So that's the next thing. So I'm probably going to bring up Kingdom of Heaven again now that door's been open. So it's really literally one of my favorite movies, but it's so bad and at the same time.
No avoiding it now.
Yeah. So we want to talk about what caused the Crusades and the Crusaders' mentality.
And hopefully get over some modern misconceptions in it as well. So,
yeah.
So there's several different kind of plights into it. So we talked about Byzantium. They're on the front lines and everything, and they're trying to hold on, but there's rise of several problems outside their borders. The primary one is the Seljuk Turks, who rise out from sort of the whole infighting and figuring out who's in charge among the Muslim lands. But they were able to take over much of the Byzantine lands. And the Byzantians calls out for aid to their Western brothers, saying, hey, this land was ours. It was ours first. It was ours for centuries before these guys were ever around. We need help retaking them. And so there are a lot of warriors fighting off in Europe and still trying to figure out how to do this right. There was still being a spread of the chivalry code. And so there was a lot of warriors needing guided to a just fight.
Real quick, if you don't mind. One thing that's kind of interesting about this time is we have all these warriors, but at this time in Europe, there's a lot more stability at this point because there's a lot more centralized governments that can help take care. Yep. And so there's a lot of warriors kind of sitting around without a chance to fight.
A lot of thinking of the bad things they've done along the way as well.
Exactly. So you've got kind of this almost perfect storm of, okay, I'm a warrior. I don't really know what else to do. I know that I have blood on my hands. And then you hear, you know, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's okay. We'll come back. We'll kind of pull it all back in. But, and then you hear I can get, you know, a redemption in the Holy Land. So that's kind of a little of what's going on. So,
So they call for aid. And by this time, Augustine, who was several centuries before this, but a lot of his works and his theology on, not a lot of things, but in this in particular, just war theory, has spread throughout Europe. It was through a book called City of God that he first coins this term that we still use to this day. And it was about what is a good and righteous war? Is it possible for the Christian to fight for a good cause and in good manners as well, in a righteous manner? While still keeping his faith. And he argued that, yes, there was, but there were certain requirements needed to be met, and it still wasn't always the most pleasant or nice option, but it may have been a necessary option at times. So a lot of that theology is taken over. We may get more into detail about some of those prerequisites at some other point in time, but I agree with a lot of what he had to say about this.
So he wasn't a Quaker?
Yes.
Okay, just checking.
Don't just lie down and take it. There are good fights, not only defensively, but even offensively to be made.
Absolutely.
Another theological I don't know, thought that kind of was taken up at the time, or practice that was taken up at the time, that really contributed to all this is the idea of plenary, if I'm pronouncing it right, indulgences.
So what's an indulgence?
A lot of it ties into purgatory as well, which only the Catholics hold to. From what I understand of Orthodox do not hold to purgatory. It is only the Catholics. Protestants obviously do not. But to try and summarize a different rabbit hole real quick, essentially there is a holding place where you're doing your time for your sins before you get to go to heaven.
So you were good enough to not go to hell,
Yes.
but you aren't good enough yet to get to heaven. And so you have to work off that. And so it's almost hell light.
Yeah.
It's where you have to go through your suffering. Yeah. So
Essentially for yourself or for others, thankfully you can make a donation to the church to help reduce their time later on in this purgatory that definitely has scriptural that it does not scriptural that. I'm sorry. We might get into how they kind of try to fit that in later on, but just for now, no, it's not scripture.
it's bad theology at best and just plain deception at worst. Let's just be honest.
But for the time, people believed that this was the truth because, again, the Word of God was being given in Latin and local languages, and people didn't have the Bible for themselves at the time. So they trusted their authority on issues like these, and unfortunately, in this instance, the authorities got this wrong.
And real quick, there is something to be said for trusting the church to teach you.
Yeah.
But
Authority
that said,
the authority in itself is not bad.
right. That being said, there should be checks and balances. And what's the biggest checks and balances? Being good breeds and knowing the scripture for yourself.
Yep.
So you're not pulled into things that are wrong. Yeah.
So indulgence essentially, hey, we're going to shorten your time with this. And a plenary indulgence was essentially full pardon. You get escape. You don't have to do any penance whatsoever. You go and do this teensy little thing of going and fighting a holy war for us, and all the sins you've ever committed are now scot-free. You're good to go.
So plenary is a full pardon. And so it comes out that, and I don't remember for sure. I know Pope Urban is the one that kind of starts some of this fervor. I don't remember if he's the one that first says that if you fight in a crusade, you automatically get a full pardon. But at least somewhere along the line, one of the popes makes that a bull into a bull, and that becomes the thing.
So Byzantium calls out for aid, and Pope Urban II is on board with it. So at the Council of Pizza, if you take out the middle syllable,
Piacenza,
he preaches a sermon essentially to really rile up the base of the leaders who were there, and that called for aid to our Eastern Christian brethren. Now, he wasn't expecting a huge army. He was expecting like several thousand will send there as kind of a relief army to help the Byzantines, but not anything massive. However, there were some lay pastors that essentially continued to take up the call as they're going about the countryside and really rile up people to go and partake in this. And it really impassioned the masses. They didn't, they were very, very effective at getting people to be on board. And so there ended up, was 100,000, the 100,000 was coming to my mind. Is 100,000 right?
That sounds right. I don't remember numbers.
So they're several thousand is what they're expecting. They get 100,000 knights and soldiers to partake in this crusade. And they even rile up a good number of non-soldiers as well. To decide, you know what? We don't need to wait on the warriors. We're going to go and take the Holy Land back for ourselves.
We don't need swords for fighting.
No, that's overrated. Let's just go. And so there was kind of a pre-First Crusade called the People's Crusade, where they went without, any warriors. They didn't really have supplies. They kind of raided Byzantium to help feed themselves, which should make Byzantium very happy because, I'm sorry, you're supposed to be helping us, and now you're raiding us to keep alive.
And you can't even fight for us either.
No, they kind of got mercilessly slaughtered. So the People's Crusade was a disaster. But a few months later, the actual warrior got there.
And something else I think that's important to mention is eschatology. So if you're not familiar with that term, eschatology is end-time theology, right? It's the idea of what is going to happen. What does the Bible teach us? The eschatology that most crusaders probably believed in at the time was that they could usher in the kingdom of God, right?
They can take the Holy Land back for ourselves. We can set up Christian kingdom there. And through that, Christ was going to come back and reign.
and there's the millennial kingdom, right?
You all sing Kumbaya.
So that really pushes this fervor,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll see that kind of hang on for another couple hundred years at least.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really kind of, I mean, that kind of leads into that as well, is that, and I don't know if you guys, another aside, I don't know for everybody that would be listening, or even for you, Nathan, but I feel like eschatology a lot of time gets pushed to the back burner as, oh, it's not that important. And
It's so hard to corrupt her.
yeah, it's one of the two, but is it a major doctrine that is a salvation issue? Depends on what you do with it, but for the most part, it is not, a tenet of the faith that has to be right. There is definitely chance for disagreement and stuff,
As long as the Revelation is the most clear book ever written.
Yeah. In fact, I think Nathan and I would come down a little different on things, just like, honestly, and neither one of us would probably agree with our church's stance on it and everything, and that's fine. But eschatology actually matters, because eschatology affects how you live your life, right? And how you work out your faith before Christ comes back.
Mm-hmm.
And so eschatology is important. I think this is a really good point here, where you can see eschatology drives a massive phenomenon. Now, as we just went through all of these, that's not the only reason,
Right.
but that did have a pretty big effect, I think, on it, especially I think of for the lay people as well. So
yeah. And going over a couple more things that kind of are setting up the First Crusade. One, there is the Great Schism finally. Speaking of theological divides, the Catholics and Orthodox did split a couple decades before this crusade happened.
Mm-hmm.
It is still early enough that we're not too tense. It's like, okay, we're going to go our way, you're going to go your way. We're not on the same page anymore, but we can still kind of be brothers and friends. It's not like it's full-blown rivalry or attacking one another yet. We'll get to that one with a different crusade. But it is starting to split harder and harder as these crusades are going to continue on as well.
Yeah. And the reason that Byzantium is calling for it is because of the Seljuk Turk invasion, Muslim armies.
Yeah.
So there's a few crusades. We're going to go over a good amount of them, but there's actually a lot more than we'll be able to cover. But we'll talk about the First Crusade first. That seems to make sense.
The Second Crusade first?
I mean, we can. It'd just be kind of awkward and confusing.
Sure.
So the first one starts in 1096 and lasts till about 1099. One of the big things that we need to know ahead of time is the goals are not clearly defined. It's basically, go aid them.
Okay, we're going to help them, and something about getting back their lands. We're not going to define that territory super clearly yet. You go right. Let's just go fight people.
Yeah.
I mentioned for a fight.
Yep.
Redemption.
But again, I want to be careful, because I don't want us to paint this picture that that the only reason they're going is for indulgence, or the only reason they're going is because they're just sitting there itching for a fight. I think those things do play into it.
Yeah.
But I also think there's some legitimate, hey, how long has this land been in Christian hands?
We're going to names on the cities they took over first, and it's like, oh, those are actually super familiar. This is definitely Christian heritage.
I mean, Jerusalem is where our faith, it has so many roots in that. That's Jesus was there. That's where he's crucified, buried, all that stuff. But, going even back further, lots of other things. That's one of the cities they take from the Canaanites way back in Joshua and all that. And so, there's a heritage there, and there's, whether it's misguided or not, I think we'll comment on that later when we kind of work through things. Their goal is to serve the Lord in this way. Whether that's misguided or not, I don't know. We're going to keep hashing that out.
Right.
But, this was a religious thing for them. This was a way to serve the Lord.
Work out their faith.
So they get to Constantinople, which is the capital of the Eastern Kingdom still. And they swear oath to Alexius, the emperor, to give back Byzantine lands. So we, at least, while we didn't define what those lands are, we defined that they were going back to Byzantine hands. That's important. So first objective was to retake Nicaea.
You may have heard of that. It has some Christian history. Again, there's tie-in.
which was in the hands of a bunch of drunks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, under the Sultanate of Ra.
I think that's just a coincidence, but it's kind of fun to say that they were drunks.
Great, a bunch of drunks took over the city.
Yep.
We had to do about this.
So they're able to take Nicaea. They're able to take, next they take Antioch.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was pretty much what was supposed to be done.
Mhm.
They're supposed to be done there. But if you look at a map, which we can't show you because we're doing an audio podcast, but if you look at a map, you kind of go from Constantinople, Nicaea area, because Nicaea is actually pretty close to Constantinople. You move over to Antioch, and then guess what? You clear the Mediterranean, and just straight south is what? Jerusalem.
And no one said anything about not taking Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that, to step back for a second, is the Muslim forces are divided due to their internal strife between the Sunni and Sunni and Shiite factions. And so I think something to be said for, they get all this momentum and the Christians kind of feel a little invincible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sure fighting was still bad. There still were losses, but they feel pretty confident in their prowess here. So, so they turn towards Jerusalem, and the Crusaders decide, why not? It was ours historically, right? So they siege Jerusalem and take it back. And this is something we could probably kind of work through a little bit, but they slaughter many. I mean, they say the streets were in blood, red with blood. So
it is not the first time that has been said of Jerusalem.
Absolutely.
Actually, some of the prophets.
Absolutely. So that being said, you'll hear, when you hear historians talk about this, that the Muslims were mostly peaceful. When they took over Jerusalem, they didn't kill all the Christians, which seems to be true. At least for that one thing. But we do know that the way that things normally went was, as we mentioned earlier, the Muslims come in, they take over, they say convert or pay a tax, and then after a while that tax runs out and they say, okay, convert or die. So this is not saying one's right or one's wrong.
Right. But this is saying that I'm wrong.
Yes.
At the beginning of their faith, they had to take over cities. They went through northern Africa. They took Spain. It had a history, and it's been ongoing. This is the latest development in that.
Yeah. So, again, I can't stress enough, the modern picture is Muslims are over here kind of minding their own business, just being peaceful, doing, whatever they're doing.
Doing Muslim things in lands that have always been Muslim, except for the fact that it was only invented a couple hundred years ago.
And then these Western people who just want land and want to take over stuff, and they just use it as an excuse to go because they're bloodthirsty. Again, we're going to call a spade a spade. Killing all those people just to kill them, I personally, I'm not okay with that, especially non-combatants. We just talked about the code. That's not okay. But it's not, I think the picture needs to be painted that, first of all, there was bloodthirstiness on both sides, and there was fighting on both sides. So we kind of have to paint the whole picture, I guess. So
it wasn't a random piece of land. It's Jerusalem and Antioch and Nicaea. Again, we've talked already about church history. Those names have come up. So
yeah, I mean, there were literally very important bishops throughout that. And I don't know for this for sure. This is not something I looked into, but I'm going to assume that Alexandria is one of the places on the way to Spain when the Muslims moved through, because it would have been one of the big hubs. I have a feeling there was probably some, so 2 of the 3 main, and then if you add Constantinople, 4 main hubs of Christianity were taken from them by force. So that aside, another interesting thing that happens here is the monastic night orders are formed.
So technically, Jerusalem stay kind of, everyone's like, yay, great, we won the crusade, let's go back home now. Right?
No. So then they set up the Crusader states, and because of that, well, we kind of need knights in standing, ready to go, protect it,
protect from outside organized empires, protect from raiders. We got pilgrims coming in who want to visit the holy sites and to kind of help develop their own faith. They need people to protect them.
Yep. And so the ones that you're going to know are the Templars and the Hospitallers. We've all heard those. There's the mystic ideal of the Templars, who they have this secret knowledge that, that's kind of where whole Da Vinci Code goes into some and everything. But And then the Hospitallers they started out as kind of medics, and and then they became, there's also some of the other orders that we don't really need to talk about here, but I find interesting, like the Teutonic Knights that were kind of more in the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic lands at the time. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing because, I mean, I think a lot of people would struggle to, as they think of this as a dichotomy, right? You're a monk, but you're armed to the teeth and you're fighting. Now, granted, there is precedent for this way out east with the Shaolin monks and things like that. Not precedent of Christianity necessarily, but this isn't like a very unheard of thing except for this area, right? In Christianity.
For Christianity.
And I think maybe that's another thing we can talk through is, should we have whole orders dedicated to the faith that are all about battle, so that's something I can get into more. So Crusader states are formed, even to the point they come up with a king. I think the first one was King Baldwin.
Oh, wait a minute, I thought these were Byzantine lands.
Exactly. So that's kind of something that's kind of interesting is they kind of gave, I think, Nicaea back and a few other things, but then they're kind of like, mine.
But you promised, but we didn't define.
Yeah. And so that's, again, that great schism is kind of getting a little wider here.
A little less trust of the West from the East at this point. So there's a couple decades where we decide not to have a crusade, but in 1145 we decide, hey, we need a crusade again because all these Crusader states are under assault again by the Muslim forces. This time, however, Byzantium is not calling for aid, but the Pope still says, hey, we need to help out the Crusader states. This is super important, guys, I swear. People are a little bit slower to respond to this one, but eventually they get some forces mustered. They get them down there. This one, they have a little bit of a strong start, but they pretty quickly get bogged down. Siege warfare is as slow and just it's a slog of a thing. Lots of waiting going around. And the Second Crusade is just, it's kind of pathetic in all honesty. At one point, the Crusader armies decide that they're not happy with one of their allies in the city of Damascus. And like, you guys aren't helping us as much as you ought to be. So we're going to siege down your city instead. And so they do. And they take out one of their allies. Congratulations. And that's how the Second Crusade kind of just goes out with
it meekly goes away.
Yep. Well, that was the thing we tried.
Yeah. And, we're supposed to be allies coming to help you, but we take one of your cities and weaken you even more. This makes sense.
Don't worry, that won't come up again later.
Yeah, no. So we're going to go into the Third Crusade now.
It's the one you're thinking of.
Yep, this is the one you know of, exactly. So it starts in 1189, lasts till about 1192. Definitely the most well-known and romanticized one.
I think real quick on the time frame, like you'll notice a lot of these are like 2 or 3 year things. We tend to have a modern idea that these were decades-long slugs, and it happened several times over a century and a half or so, but they weren't necessarily long wars in and of themselves, especially for ancient times as well. So that's a little bit of a misconception we tend to have.
Yeah. So you're going to actually have some people you're going to recognize in here. So the big names such as Frederick Barbarossa is part of it, the Holy Roman Emperor. Saladin or Saladin, if you want to go more anglicized.
Yeah, one of the most revered tacticians and as rulers in general of the Islamic land.
And he's kind of interesting in that he's revered in Muslim lands and by Muslims, but also Christians, and really just in general, people see him as a merciful and well thought out leader,
but still fierce in battle.
Still fierce in battle. And then, of course, last is good old Richard the Lion. So from England, so he's there as well. So what started this all off is Saladin captures Jerusalem and surrounding territory in 1187, which we just said this crusade starts in 1189. So this is kind of a response to that. Calls in the West to recover lost territory. I think it's a good time to stop here and say Byzantium once again is not asking for aid. I don't think that happens again. And so this is kind of just a general, hey, we lost this territory, let's go get it back. So Richard and Saladin are great generals and fight to the point that they get to a stalemate.
Both brilliant tacticians, and it's like they're not able to outdo each other here.
Yeah. So this is partly due to their own prowess, but also partly because of issues back home. So Saladin's still dealing with internal Muslim strife, and Richard the Lionheart is still dealing with, or is dealing with his, I believe this is a brother, John, who is his ruling, and he's, maybe not doing the right things. So we'll come back to that in a second.
Get a certain person of the
Yeah. So, so Saladin and Richard form a truce, and basically they say Saladin gets to keep the lands, but Christian pilgrims are to be unhindered. So there's a safe conduct for Christian pilgrims to come and do their thing, but Saladin keeps control. So, however, this arrangement dies with Saladin in 1193.
So a year after the crusade ends, unfortunately, Saladin dies, and the next person in line says, yeah, I don't need to honor that agreement anymore, which is why the fourth crusade here in a minute is going to have such a quick turnaround for when it occurs compared to some previous.
Yeah, so Saladin dies very, very quickly after that, but Richard the Lionheart heads back to England to deal with John being, good old reprobate. And you'll recognize all this because this is where a lot of the stories from Robin Hood come. It's kind of interesting because, we always think of the modern, he's just a normal guy who's really good with the bow, but some historians think that, it's probably based off a real guy who was probably a crusader who had returned back to the lands. And so that's why he and his friends had the martial prowess to beat the local sheriffs and who were not as at least they may have been trained, but they weren't as martially trained in battle and all that. And so kind of interesting, but that's where the legend of Robin Hood comes from. So, yeah.
Onward to the Fourth Crusade. So again, quick turnaround. Saladin dies in 1193, which means suddenly we're not protecting the Christian pilgrims anymore. And so they kind of forcefully take Jerusalem back, and they're not being so nice to the agreement that was just honored. So we want another holy war because we want Jerusalem back again.
So we're going to call this one, instead of the Fourth Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, because it's a curse. It's bad.
Also, we typed it wrong in our notes, so behind the curse.
That was intentional, actually. I put it there. Remember, we kind of made the joke, and we're like, let's stick with it.
So they form the army again. Okay, let's go take it back. Once again, boys, into the breach. On the way, they go by way of Venice. They make some contracts to get a bunch of ships and boats, and we're going to ship all the men off that way, and we'll totally pay you for it. They didn't pay them for it. That kind of left Venice suddenly empty-pocketed with all of that, a little bit of shenaniganery. The Byzantine Empire is like, okay, you guys are down here again for you're going to take the lands, just why? And the Crusaders are like, yeah, if you're going to be complaining about us, we want a new guy in charge of you guys now, because we don't want you to be a problem while we're dealing with our own problems down here. Believe it or not, the guy in charge in the Byzantine Empire doesn't want to give up his throne. Weird that people in power don't give up their throne.
Yes, that seems like a foreign concept to me. I don't know.
Previous crusade and the Great Schism itself is pretty well exacerbating this whole East-West distrust of each other by this point. And unfortunately, there's the Crusader armies kind of wait outside Constantinople, like, do we really like these guys? And there's not like official siege right off the bat, but there's kind of this awkward tension. Then they decide, we're going to take their city. And so the Crusader armies, instead of, attacking any of the lands they were originally going to retake, decide, hey, let's take the one of the strongholds of the Christian faith, which has not fallen since it was first established in 330, so several hundred years it has stood firm. And let's take out our Christian brothers. It's
close to 1,000, actually. Getting close, yeah.
So they sack Constantinople very strongly, weaken the city. It's probably one of the biggest reasons it will eventually fall to Muslim forces and eventually become Istanbul later on. And it's a very sad testament. It stood for so long, and then friendly fire among fellow Christians and intentional friendly fire takes it out. Really, guys, is this where we've fallen? And it kind of shows how far the Crusader mentality has fallen. First, so it's like we're reclaiming our lost Christian lands. We're defending our Christian brothers. Now we are fighting our Christian brothers, and we are taking their Christian lands. And it's like we have gotten so warped from where we were with the beginning of all these crusades. Like, where did we go wrong?
well, and the whole idea of the chivalric code is just thrown out the window. I mean, yeah, it's almost, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised because human nature, right? Even though we may hold to the Christian faith, doesn't mean that we don't lose sin, unfortunately, not until, depending on your idea of that. Maybe that's one thing we'll talk about at some point. But, we still are sinful. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really just, it's almost, I really don't have words. It's just crazy to me. I mean, again, we probably shouldn't be that
Right.
surprised, but it's just crazy that you would sack Constantinople. I mean, come on. So, a couple other, I mean, there were crusades going on all this time, all kinds of little ones.
It became pretty fashionable for popes to call crusades to retake certain things. But yeah.
So a couple other ones that we wanted to mention of note. So there's the crusade to retake Spain.
It's kind of part of the reconquistas we talked about before. Kind of kick the Muslims out. We're going to re-solidify the Christian culture there.
Yeah.
So,
and then the Albigensian crusade.
That's right.
That sounds good enough to me. They were some Swiss people that were dualistic heretics. So they called themselves Christians, but I don't remember the details of their.
So essentially, dualism, it goes back even further, even into the Jewish heritage. But essentially, it's the idea that God and the devil are essentially equal beings, right? And so there's this constant battle between good and evil, and it almost like justifies evil and sinfulness and this, that, and the other. It's really heretical and all of that.
So there's a crusade to try to wipe that heresy out. And then the last one's kind of the most interesting and almost sad. Yeah. So it's called the Children's Crusade. You said, you're probably going, you said children's, right? Yeah. Children's Crusade. So starts with 6 to 14-year-olds or so. They kind of start marching the streets, kind of a civil disobedience of, we need to go back on crusade. So let's stop there. This shows kind of where this crusader mentality had so permeated and in a warped way.
Yeah.
Why were kids worried about the Holy Land? Right? Why? Yeah. So
for a little context, this is about 10 years after the miserable Fourth Crusade.
Yeah. So basically everybody's kind of like, okay, we're crusaded out, which is probably not completely the case, but no one really calls,
kids go off.
Yeah.
No.
So they just start like good kids, just go home and say whatever, right?
No.
They decide to go on crusade themselves.
We can take the holy city.
So they head to, what city was it again?
I don't remember. It was a port city, though, on the Mediterranean. They were going to sail down to get to Jerusalem, and from there retake all the Holy Lands. And from there, they disappear. There's a mystery. There's some speculation, but there's at least some level of mystery to what happens to them. First, for context, there was estimated on the low end was 7,000, is that correct? And on the upper end, 30,000. One of the guys I've been listening to for a lot of her research, he thinks that the estimates there should be somewhere between 10 and 15,000 children who certainly went missing.
Yeah. So obviously foul play, things that,
slave trade is one of the more common explanations that he just got sold to slavery and shipped off all over the world. And so tens of thousands of children just went missing from all this warped mentality that has now been developed.
Well, and, as a father, kind of going, where were you, parents? Like, what's going on here? I mean, now granted, again, we want to be careful not to use our modern lenses too much. So, I mean, I don't know what medieval family life looked like and what how easy would it be for them just to walk away and go do this. But to have that many leave home, it just makes you go,
none of the local powers stopping them along the way.
Yeah, it's just crazy to me. But anyway, so there's the Crusades.
At least a very general overview of the whole.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those where it's like, at first, that's like the first definitely sounds like, let's help out our Byzantine brothers. That sounds great to me. Like, we kind of ended on a weird sour note with that. It's okay, we're gonna do a little bit more. Like, I don't even necessarily mind the taking Jerusalem. you can go back and forth on their slaughter afterward. Because, there's uncomfortable passages in the Old Testament. Yeah, kill them all, man, woman, and child. Like, is that one of those times? I don't know all the details about what all was happening back then, so it's harder for me to make the call about what was, if what was happening in Jerusalem mimicked some of the atrocities that God loathed the Canaanites for. But at least from the idea of retaking historically Christian land and getting it back, like, that to me, yeah, that still seems fine. The addition of Jerusalem to all that.
And I think to go along with those thoughts, for me, it's protecting the Christians that are in the land, because if they're not there to reinforce, then slowly the Muslim invasion keeps happening. And then that means people dying in innocents dying, or not innocents, because none of us are innocent, but non-combatants dying, Christian non-combatants. And so I think I agree with you for the most part. I think it was fine. It was justified. That's great. Protect people, especially in lands that were ours.
Giving it back to Byzantium.
Right. But then that's, I think, where we kind of go, because it was their land, but I think, to kind of comment on the Jerusalem slaughtering, my thought is, so where I struggle with is, and I think we talked about this earlier off air or whatever, in the Bible, it's clearly mandated by God himself. I think that's a hard sell for me personally if you don't hear from God himself. In my judgment, I don't feel comfortable going, okay, let's commit genocide today, and that's a little strong, but it's not in the Old Testament context. And so I think that's where I kind of go, I would probably err on the side of maybe, saying, hey, we'll allow you to leave, safe passage back to your own lands, things like that, or, this is a Christian society now, you're welcome to stay, but you're going to live as a Christian, not, those kind of things.
And the common soldier is obviously going to have questions about all that anyway as well, because even if you look at Old Testament examples, God talks to the prophets and the leaders themselves. The common soldier who's having to do all this thing, he's not talking directly to in the same manner as he is Moses or Joshua or the prophets as well. So, like they were probably wrestling with some of the same questions that some of the Crusaders were with all of this. So,
absolutely.
Probably lots of similarities abound between the situations, but some questions about how many differences also still lie there. So.
Yeah. So, I think the big thing we need to do with history like this is, I think it's part of our heritage, so we can't shy from it. We can acknowledge that Christians are fallible. We can acknowledge that we are fallible as well. But I think what we need to acknowledge too is, are we working out our faith in a biblical way? And I think when we look at the Crusades and things, I think there were some good things and some honorable things that were done. There were lots of terrible things that were done in the name of Christ. So I think it's hard to we just went through 600 or 700 years of history. Really quickly between the last episode and this episode.
History that is still very different, particularly to us in U.S. time, where we don't have to worry about the violence. We don't experience a lot of these things on a day-to-day basis.
And I think that's the other point, which I can't remember. Did we talk about this in the last episode? The last episode we did 4 times, so I don't remember what all we actually covered. So if this is a repeat, you get to hear it again. But, it was inundated with violence. That was what they knew, and so it's easy for us to go, well, they just decided one day they're going to go kill a bunch of people. Well, that's not really what happened.
Right.
Or again, the whole misconception that the Muslims were just kind of sitting over here peacefully, in their lands. There's so much more nuance and so much more to it. And that's true of any history, right?
We didn't go over, there was an almost crusade also called, as the Muslims would eventually go into and nearly sack all of Poland as well. So it's a continuation back and forth of this violent dance between the two worlds there.
Right. And I know a lot of people, modern people, would say, well, it takes someone to quit the violence, but that's the person that gets conquered and wiped out too. So, now you could say, do you turtle up and be more defensive? Do you be offensive? But sometimes being offensive is the best defense, literally. And so, I'm not going to get into military tactics and all that. That's not what we're here for. But I think it's good to kind of understand the Constantinization, we'll call it, of the Western Christian empires, lands. I think this all comes because of Constantine. We can go all the way back to Constantine and say, if it weren't for Constantine Christianizing Rome, this, now, could it have still happened later on? Could it have happened a different way? Yes. Is it likely? Probably not.
Probably a lot of paganism would still be around for centuries, if not millennia after that point. So
we'll probably get more into this legacy of Constantine and kind of talk through, like, is this good? Is it bad? Or what's good and what's bad?
I'm looking at how we eventually decided, we're done with this experiment, let's go a different way. And then now we kind of abandoned that altogether. And has that really worked out either? So.
Right. Well, the one thing you can say for Constantine's legacy is Christianity was spread further than probably it ever would have been otherwise.
Yeah.
And pretty much the whole world knows of Christianity and Christ. So that's at least something we can say that's probably a good thing, right? Because we want to spread to all nations and to all peoples, to all tribes, all tongues. So at the very least here, I think it's a good time to kind of just note that, most lands other than very remote places or places that were suppressed really strongly, Christianity and Christ has been preached. And that's that's what we want, right? That's what Christ wants. So that's a good thing. So I think that's something to be kind of brought up here after all the terribleness, the terrible things that have happened that we just talked about. That's a good thing to think about is, and it's always fun to look at how God brings about things at the right time of history, where you have the Roman infrastructure to spread things, to spread the gospel. Then you bring along Constantine, who becomes a Christian and helps to promulgate Christianity even further. And then, just if it weren't for Constantine, again, would we be Christians? Would we have heard the gospel?
Well, we know what the Christian is, because again, he calls for, hey, we're new to this all. What do you guys believe? And kind of calls to get on board with what we need to know for the basics of the faith as well. So.
Exactly. Where would theology have gone without his influence at Nicaea and everything? So, yeah. Any other thoughts?
No. So we'll continue to look at it and kind of that legacy, how it's gone. And again, our eventual deciding to experiment with, let's take away and separate a little bit more of this whole church and state thing as we go along as well. Really, the next couple episodes, we are going to get into, eventually into the scriptural, just, looking back at all this history, what does scripture say about what a government is supposed to do? And kind of, we might be able to take a little bit of some of the highlights and then kind of compare it and like, okay, here's the characterization of the Bible say that government's supposed to have. How did this one line up? And then kind of learn from all of that, both scripture and then how history matched up for it and what that might mean for us today as well. So,
yeah. So keep listening.
Yeah.
We're going to keep bringing it to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This has been Discerning Faith. The Lord be with you and bless you.